Uh-huh. Please take your seat and we try to start. Ce l'abbiamo fatta. Salve. Ok, io faccio interaction e tu luego te passo la parola. Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see such a full room for such an important topic. I would like to welcome all the speakers and journalists and other participants and give you some practical information before I hand the floor to our speakers. First of all, you have on your desks the copy of the program, as well as a link with a QR code that connects you to all the press kit and the complementary information about the speakers, but also about the topic that we are going to discuss today, media freedom, on this very day where the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize will be awarded for the second time to one of you, because the finalists are sitting in the room with us. Apart from the information that you find on your desk or on the rows, please be aware that there is interpretation. You see the cabins are on in English, French, Italian, Bulgarian, and Russian. So you can ask your questions in any of these languages. We also have participants online on Interaxio, which is the platform that people who are interested in interacting with these panels should use. We also have web streaming, but please, if you are journalists and you are watching us, go on the Interaxio link, because there you can connect and ask questions later on. In Interaxio, there is also the same interpretation that I said before. And you should write your name in the chat and say to whom you would like to address your question. And then once we read out your name, we will give you the floor. You have to push the button to speak. So the button speak. And then you become, the button becomes red and you can speak. And with this, I give the floor to Jesus, Director of Media in the European Parliament, to moderate this first session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafaela, and welcome to all of you. Dear Vice President, dear Matthew, this is a very important. The situation in the world is deteriorating dramatically for the journalists, and we want to speak about this today. But first of all, I would like to give a special welcome to all of you, journalists, representatives of press associations, and from the academic world, NGOs. A special welcome to the finalists of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize and the jury. And also welcome to the family of Daphne. You are here, Corinne, Matthew, and our friend, our member, David Casa. I would like to welcome particularly to our Vice President of the European Parliament, Pina Picierno, who organized this seminar to honor the memory of Daphne Caruana and to bring some light to the current situation of media in the world. Pina Picierno is the Vice President of this House. Her work in the European Parliament mainly focuses on gender equality and women's rights. Freedom of press and safeguard of journalists are key elements in her political vision. And she comes from a region where the right to investigation has always been threatened by the organized crime. Ms. Picierno, why do you think it is important that the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize and that we do not stop talking and defending media freedom? The floor is yours, please.
Grazie Jesus, io approfitterò della traduzione, quindi parlerò in italiano. Buonasera naturalmente a tutte e a tutti, è un onore ed è un piacere davvero grande accogliervi questa sera nella casa di tutte e di tutti, nella casa dei diritti e della democrazia, e cioè nel Parlamento europeo. Io vi sono davvero molto grata per aver accettato il nostro invito, per aver voluto condividere con noi in un momento così delicato le vostre esperienze, la vostra lotta per un mondo più giusto, per un mondo più equo, dove il diritto ad una libera informazione sia davvero garantito e tutelato. Lo diceva Jesus, io sono nata in Italia, una terra che nel corso degli anni ha visto pagare ai suoi giornalisti un prezzo davvero molto molto alto in termini di sangue, ma anche di vite spezzate, di vite sotto scorta e sotto continue intimidazioni. E il mio impegno pubblico nasce proprio grazie alla storia, al coraggio, alle parole, fatemi dire così, di un grande giornalista napoletano, si chiamava Giancarlo Siani e fu ucciso a 26 anni dalla camorra. Giancarlo era colpevole di aver ricostruito le trame del narcotraffico partenopeo e delle infiltrazioni delle organizzazioni criminali nelle istituzioni. E io ho scoperto la sua storia da adolescente, quasi per caso, mentre mi interrogavo sulle luci e sulle ombre della mia terra. E nei suoi articoli ho trovato e trovo, ieri come oggi, la spinta, la forza politica e morale, la motivazione per lavorare ogni giorno, per il cambiamento necessario e per il bene comune. E questa, fatemi dire, è la forza del giornalismo, che coincide in ultima analisi con la forza della democrazia. Questa è la forza di donne e uomini come voi, che partecipate a questo incontro. Essere un avamposto di libertà e di lotta per il diritto alla conoscenza e di contrasto ai sistemi criminali. La storia di Giancarlo Siani, nonostante siano passati 37 anni, è di un'attualità drammatica. Sicuramente, certo, sono stati assicurati alla giustizia i mandanti, gli esecutori del suo assassinio, ma tutti i problemi relativi alla professione giornalistica che Siani viveva sono esattamente sempre le stesse e forse addirittura si sono amplificate. Il precariato, gli standard salariari non idonei, la legislazione di molti paesi che non prevede argini alle querele temerarie sono i problemi irrisolti di cui l'Europa si sta facendo carico e che dovrà risolvere assolutamente nei prossimi mesi, perché mai come in questo momento avere un giornalismo libero e forte è una necessità del nostro sistema democratico, anzi è esso stesso sistema democratico, perché rende trasparente e giudicabile l'esercizio del potere politico e degli altri poteri pubblici e privati, una funzione che è propria di qualsiasi democrazia evoluta. E allora le sfide per la libera informazione sono aumentate nel corso di questi anni. La capacità mimetica della criminalità organizzata che ormai investe addirittura in sistemi legali le proprie risorse e la sardatura con le oligarchie rendono maggiori le difficoltà nel racconto della realtà, maggiori le difficoltà nel vostro lavoro. Il digitale, i social media, l'eccesso di informazioni rendono tutto instabile, tutto esposto continuamente a fake news, a tentativi di manipolazione, ma un formidabile strumento tecnologico di accrescimento e di emancipazione popolare non può inverarsi nella esaltazione della menzogna, che non può essere elevata a categoria filosofica, perché se non si crede più in nessuno, si finisce col credere a tutti. E questo accade sempre a danno dei più deboli, dei più marginali, di chi non ha potere, di chi non ha strumenti. Anche per questo noi siamo consapevoli che il primo attacco allo Stato di diritto e alla stabilità di uno Stato colpisce sempre prima la stampa libera. E in questi mesi in cui la terribile invasione russa dell'Ucraina ha stravolto il piano delle priorità politiche dell'Unione Europea, si è compreso ancora di più e fino in fondo quanto le interferenze russe nei nostri sistemi informativi siano assolutamente un pezzo di questo conflitto. Il regime di Putin gioca un pezzo importante della sua guerra ibrida nella distorsione delle informazioni, nel rovesciamento della realtà, nel rovesciamento della storia, nel tentativo costante di criminalizzazione del popolo e del governo ucraino. E la disinformazia del Cremlino si avvale di raffinate modalità di propaganda che hanno messo nel corso del tempo nel loro mirino anche il Parlamento e le istituzioni europee, gettando discredito e cercando di far germogliare tra la popolazione europea un sentimento di avversità, molto spesso costruito ad arte. Dunque la libertà di stampa e di informazione è una questione non solo di valori e di principi, ma un pezzo fondamentale della nostra sicurezza. E per questo motivo io penso che il lavoro che tutti voi svolgete ogni giorno sia essenziale per il mantenimento di uno standard alto di democrazia delle nostre società. Attentati, violenze, intimidazioni, omicidi, querele temerarie, campagne di pubblico discredito sono i rischi a cui ogni giorno le giornaliste e i giornalisti sono esposti in tutto il mondo, pagando un prezzo altissimo. Penso al lavoro incessante dei giornalisti ungheresi, polacchi, che hanno subito attacchi violentissimi da parte delle istituzioni governative, o penso al grande lavoro che svolgono i consorzi giornalistici investigativi in paesi abitati da dittature. Il primo tentativo di contaminare con il sapere la democrazia e il dibattito pubblico. Il mese di ottobre è purtroppo ricco di anniversari e di ricorrenze davvero dolorose. Il 7 ottobre, il giorno in cui Anna Politkovskaya fu uccisa. Il 16 ottobre ricordiamo un giornalista italiano di Radio Radicale, Antonio Russo, ucciso anche lui a Tbilisi. Entrambi raccontavano senza sconti il regime di Putin e la guerra in Cecenia. Entrambi, in anticipo rispetto ai tempi, avevano individuato la minaccia che il suo disprezzo per le libertà e per i rappresentava per tutta Europa. E un filo rosso di date terribili ci porta ad un altro 16 ottobre, questa volta del 2007, quando a Malta Daphne Caruana Galizia fu uccisa in un terribile attentato. La voce di Daphne, le sue parole, la sua vita che questo Parlamento ha voluto onorare, e saluto qui il collega David Casa che ha fatto un grande lavoro anche su questo, col premio che conferiremo domani, sono una costante chiamata all'impegno. Daphne ha lottato in solitudine e questa solitudine interroga l'Europa intera, le sue istituzioni, le sue insufficienze contro la corruzione, contro il malaffare. Ha subito Daphne in vita e in morte una orribile gogna mediatica, insinuazioni vili che non hanno però fermato il portato del suo lavoro e delle sue investigazioni. E il suo sacrificio per la giustizia e per la verità rappresentano un patrimonio inestimabile per tutte le europee e per tutti gli europei, un patrimonio che è anche un monito per una lotta senza quartiere alle mafie, ai sistemi criminali che spesso si saldano con il potere politico. E dobbiamo noi ogni giorno, nei nostri posti di responsabilità, essere degni del sacrificio di Daphne, della sua storia, del suo coraggio. Di la verità anche se la tua voce trema. È una delle frasi che forse meglio racconta chi era Daphne. Avere coraggio nonostante la paura, avere forza nonostante le nostre debolezze. E in questa nuova Europa che nasce ogni giorno, il nome di Daphne Caruana Galizia è tra quelli delle madri fondatrici. E per questo io sono davvero felice e onorata di avere qui con noi Matthew Caruana Galizia e di passare a lui la parola.
Thank you very much for Vice President for your inspiring words, and a warm welcome to Matthew Caruana, the son of Daphne Caruana Galizia, murdered 5 years for making her job and informing about the truth. She was an inspiring woman, Matthew, journalist, and that's why today this prize for journalists and the press conference room of the Parliament here in Strasbourg. Matthew, you have been continuing managing your mother's legacy. You are the director of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation. The foundation exists to continue working on the case around the killing of your mother. Welcome, as well as the sister of Daphne sitting here with us, Corinne Vela. Thank you very much. Matthew, please.
Thank you. I mean, and really thank you to everyone who is here, to everyone involved in organizing the seminar, also to the Vice President for being so involved. I mean, what to say after that? No, it was an excellent speech that covered everything I would have wanted to say. Perhaps what I can add is that when my family first came to the Parliament in November 2017, which was just a few weeks, actually just a couple of days after my mum was assassinated, we had to do quite a lot of work to, I think, make everyone realize or instill that realization in everyone that my mother's assassination wasn't really an act of intolerance. She wasn't murdered just because people didn't like her. I mean, the propaganda that made people dislike her in our country, or that instilled that kind of dislike, was part of what led to the assassination, part of what enabled it, part of what facilitated it. But her assassination was intrinsically linked with the kind of cross-border corruption that exists within the European Union. That in my mother's case had Malta as a nexus. She was investigating high-level corruption, high-level organized crime within Malta, corruption in the energy sector in Malta, which led directly to her assassination. We cannot sort of come away from it just thinking that it was only a kind of intolerance for the kind of journalism that my mother did. It went far, far beyond that. So I think, coupled with the kind of protections that are being put forward by European institutions, the anti-SLAPP directive, which we support, it's crucially important, the Media Freedom Act, again, which will go a long way to tearing down the kind of systems of propaganda and disinformation which dehumanize people or used to attack journalists, defend corruption, and so on. We have to combine those kinds of initiatives with more initiatives that attack cross-border corruption, the kind of cross-border corruption that my mother was investigating and which led directly to her murder. Malta is a case in point. I'm sure that there are going to be questions about the trial which started and was over in one day, last Friday. For my family, this is a relief, But let's not forget that it's the absolute bare minimum. Even in the case of Anna Politkovskaya, which the Vice President mentioned, Putin allowed the hitmen to be convicted, because this is a country in which nothing happens without the permission of the president. So even in such extreme cases where you have complete non-democracies, are the material authors, the hitmen, in cases of murders of journalists convicted. So what Malta has achieved is really, really the absolute bare minimum. And we have not come to the trial of those involved at a higher level in the murder itself yet. They are still in custody awaiting trial. But even beyond that, we still have yet to see a prosecution for the corruption that my mother was investigating, for the corruption that led directly to her assassination. And I think for as long as we have member states in the European Union that are incapable of holding people at the highest levels of government for the kind to account, then we are never going to go beyond the murders of journalists. They are simply going to keep happening. The kind of protections that we're seeing being introduced or being proposed now are extremely, extremely important. I really want to stress that. But we have to really attack the root cause of the murders of journalists. Each one in the European Union over the past few years is directly tied to corruption or directly tied to organized crime. So we really, really need to attack those root causes. I mean, get better at ensuring that member states are not allowed to get away with impunity for high-level corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Matthew, we have time for your questions now, journalists, so please go ahead. Anyone who would like to ask a question? Who doesn't want to break the ice? It's always difficult. But yeah, maybe, Matthew, you refer to the case around your mother, that the case is finally arriving, but there's still a lot needs to be done. What do you plan to do next?
I mean, what I plan to do is different from what I hope actually happens, or what will actually probably happen. But what I definitely hope will happen, there are convictions for every single person involved in the assassination of my mother, including the people who are currently pending prosecution and are currently waiting in custody. It's really important for that to happen. If it doesn't, Malta will still remain at the kind of Russia level of impunity. But apart from that, I mean, both the Maltese government and European institutions have to learn lessons from what allowed my mother's assassination to happen. That goes back to what I was saying, that some authorities are given more powers to investigate cross-border crime. The kind of standards to which member states are held become much stronger, become more enforceable, especially with respect to criminal justice and the fight against corruption, integrity, transparency, ethics. More directly and concretely, I think the people involved in the corruption that my mother was investigating have to be prosecuted and convicted. It cannot be that after this mountain of evidence has been built up, has been put out there, that people paid with their lives, including my mother, for this evidence to be put out there. Absolutely nothing is done with it, that it comes to nothing. This is a situation that is really intolerable.
Thank you very much. Matthew, yes, please. See a question.
This one, yes. Thank you very much. My name is Mogens Blikker Bjerregaard. I'm international advisor of the Danish Union of Journalists. it's right that we need to bring the perpetrators to justice at a stage. It's absolutely terrible what has happened in Malta, and it's taken 5 years and even more. But what about making sure that the states are taking care of action before this happens? We have these national action plans that have been launched both by the Council of Europe and by the UN and UNESCO. We have the 10 years anniversary in next month for the UN Plan of Action to make sure that the states are faster in investigating when you have these cases. You go to the police, as your mother did, went to the police and nothing happened. To make sure that this happens in all states. Can't we go faster on this? It takes too much time. I mean, we don't have many action plans yet, national action plans across Europe. We should have much more at this moment. Why don't we have that?
I mean, it depends on what kind of action plan you're talking about. If it's an action plan to improve the way that institutions at the national level respond to the harassment of journalists or respond to attacks on journalists, fine, there is more that could be done there. But by that point, it is probably too late. Let's not forget that journalists start to expose information about corruption when the authorities themselves have failed to do that job first. So by that point, it is already a bit late. And when you are in a situation as a journalist where you are putting out reports about corruption, putting out evidence, putting out information, and nothing is happening, that tends to be a sign that organized crime has permeated authorities, and by going to those same authorities with your complaint on harassment, with your complaint on an attack, I mean, it is sort of unlikely that you are going to get anywhere. So again, I really stress the importance of attacking corruption and organized crime at a much more basic level. I mean, we have said this before, the European Union is stuck in a kind of situation that is very similar to the United States in the 19th century, before the creation of the FBI, where jurisdiction ended at state borders. This is, of course, making it extremely difficult for authorities to follow up on cross-border corruption and crime, even when they want to do it and when they're enabled to do it. So these are the kinds of changes that we need to see, I think. Journalists are getting more and more effective at investigating cross-border crime, money laundering, trafficking, and so on. But I think authorities have a long way to go to catch up.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for a lot of food for thoughts in these messages you are delivering. We will tackle straight away during the panel. But now I'd like to invite Duja Mijatovic to join us. You are Commissioner for Human Rights at the Council of Europe from Bosnia and Herzegovina. You have worked to protect human rights for the past 2 decades with special attention to freedom of expression. You have served as well as OSCE representative on freedom of the media. So without any further ado, Commissioner, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me, Vice President Picierno, dear Matthew, dear Corina, dear journalists. I'm really glad to see so many familiar and dear faces in this room. It is really a great honor to be here with all of you who have come together today to pay tribute to the work and also memory of Daphne Caruana Galizia, but also to discuss how we can support journalism and free media. In my work as the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights and previously as the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, I have witnessed almost on a daily basis firsthand how journalists and other media actors are threatened across Europe and beyond our continent, because we cannot really live in a bubble and only take care about what is happening here in Europe in order to understand how serious those threats are. Council of Europe member states have some of the strongest safeguards, as you know, to place in protect journalists. Freedom of expression and press freedom are enshrined both in national but also international laws. And also international organizations like mine have adopted many of procedures, but also standards, resolutions to protect press freedom. But then we ask ourselves, is this enough to tick the box and to say, yes, we adopted these documents? What is happening in practice? What is happening in the field? What is happening in conflict zones, in the war zones, is quite different. And that's the sad reality we have to take care of. But reality, as I said, also speaks of another truth. We already heard the numbers of people doing their job, revealing crime and corruption in their societies or internationally. And we can continue repeating those numbers, but particularly names, each and every name of that person that suffered because of the work they were doing. European Union was for many decades, I would say, a safe oasis for journalists to do their job. It is not like that any longer. Daphne is one, Jan Kuciak, Lara McKee, we mentioned already Anna Politkovskaya and many others. And we need to continue, as I said, repeating their names, using a very loud voice and joining our voices in calling for justice to be served. A climate of impunity that Matthew mentioned inflicts additional pain on journalists but also their families, shields perpetrators from accountability and facilitates further attacks against journalists. The recent 40-year sentence the other day imposed on the hitman responsible for Daphne's murder is a step forward in the long fight for justice. But is this enough? Of course, it is not. Now it is necessary to punish the masterminds of this terrible crime and shed full light on the motives and institutional responsibility which made it possible. Daphne's family has been the driving force to ensure that this cold-blooded is fully investigated. While the work of Matthew, Paul, and Andrew Caruana Galizia has been remarkable, and this has to be recognized, and I paid tribute to all of you. But seeking justice should not be the responsibility of a grieving family. I hope you would agree with me. It is the responsibility of states and their institutions and all of us to ensure that there is no impunity. Threats to journalism and journalists are numerous and widespread. Many of you gathered here today at this event have experienced the tragic loss, and I know that's the case, of a colleague, a friend, a family member who was working to hold those in power to account. Some of you journalists who have faced legal or administrative harassment, intimidation, or have been attacked or threatened. So all of us who are committed to democracy and free press have a duty to do absolutely everything in our power to turn this tide. The current situation is critical, but it is not hopeless. We should never give up or give in. If we join forces, we can help close the gap between standards, but also the reality. And I will just mention briefly 4 key fields of action that seem to be crucial. First, we must continue demanding the states and impunity for crimes against journalists. Second, we must demand more action to implement existing standards. Third field on which we should focus is pushing for change in the political discourse regarding, and the fourth area concerns the support we provide to initiatives aimed at protecting journalists. Vice President, This afternoon, the European Parliament will award the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize. Let me express my support for such initiatives because they help keep the problem of media freedom visible. And this is also important. It is not solving the problem, but it is important. They also help other journalists feel that they are not alone and that international organizations and people do care about them. One of Daphne's main lessons was that we must not remain silent in front of abuses. We must speak out and confront those who use power for personal advantages. Because any time we don't, we allow a further erosion of the democratic fabric of a society. Daphne's professional life was also testimony of many difficulties journalists are facing: violence, harassment, denigration, aggravated by the gender dimension, which should not be forgotten. But Daphne made the choice to speak out to defend the truth and justice. She chose to think and act with independence in the interest of the public good. This selfless devotion is the trademark of her life, and she was killed for that. Today, she is the symbol of the struggle for freedom, justice, and accountability, and it will remain so. By coming here today, we are sending a clear message that we will continue Daphne's fight and the many other journalists who do not give up. You can count on me to promote freedom of expression, to use my voice and give it to the voiceless sometimes. And this is not only a professional duty that I have, but also a personal imperative that guides and motivates me every day in my life. We must not give up, and looking at you today, I know that we will be many in proving to those who want to silence journalists that they will never succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for your presence here today. We know that you have a meeting now with the Council of Europe. So I would like to maybe close this panel, this part of the session, and continue with the program. I would like to thank Matthew for being here with us, for the huge effort you and the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation have been doing. And thank you very much again, Vice President, for organizing this event. And I pass the moderation now to Rafaela De Marte, the head of the media services. Rafaela, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesus. And while I would welcome the journalists that are with us on the podium, I propose that we pass the two video messages that we received from the two Nobel Prize winners from last year. You know that it was a very important Nobel Prize because it awarded the freedom of press and the courage of journalists to speak out. So they could not be with us, Dmitry Muratov and Maria Ressa, but we met them and they left a message. So let's show the videos, and in the meanwhile, we can move. Thank you. Yeah.
First of all, still my deep condolences to the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia. We share the same legal counsel, and her sons, Matthew and Paul, have said that the kind of dehumanization that happened to her online is set the stage for the kind of violence that killed her, the car bomb that killed her. And we see those same patterns. It's happening to us in the Philippines. It's happening to other women around the world, women targeted in particular, right? Online violence is real-world violence. When journalists are under attack, democracy is under attack. And what we have seen globally is that more people around the world now live under authoritarian rule than under democracies. The number of democracies have been rolled back to 15 years ago. And we journalists know this. I can't imagine, I couldn't have imagined what I've lived through in the last 6 years or so, 7 years. In less than 2 years, 10 arrest warrants were issued against me. I just received, the second in terms of the Court of Appeals for cyber libel. So I could go to jail now imminently, but let's see, we're fighting it. Journalists under attack have no recourse but to continue doing their jobs. But it's very clear we cannot do this alone, and civil society needs to step in. It's a question I asked at the Nobel lecture, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? Because journalists have been sacrificing, and this is it. I always say we're in the last 2 minutes of this game we call democracy. If you play basketball, last 2 minutes, and we are losing this game. In this time period, while we're waiting for the EU's Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, there's been very little protection for journalists. What can we do about it? We need to continue doing our jobs. We need to raise the alarm that disinformation is like a virus. It infects real people, changes what they think of the world, and changes the way they act. It is not a coincidence that many, many more illiberal leaders globally have been elected democratically. And like in my country, what happened is once that happens, they cave in the institutions of democracy from within. Very clear case in point is Russia, right? What it did as early as 2014 when it ceded the meta-narratives that justified the annexation of Crimea, what was seeded bottom up on social media then came top down, right? This is what's happened in every country around the world. Ukraine sounded, the social media platforms didn't pay attention. We sounded the alarm as early as 2016. And yet, until today, you have those same meta-narratives used for Crimea, now seeded deeply and reused to invade Ukraine itself, right? So it is still going on. You can see that in Russia itself, people don't know what's fact from fiction. And part of that is the complete capture of media, the fact that now there is no independent media there. Well, what's happening in Russia is coming for the rest of us around the world. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you today, but thank you so much for asking me. We're under attack. We know it. You know it. And yet we keep doing our jobs. We're coming up to the last, what we started calling the last 2 minutes of this game of democracy. We need to keep doing our jobs. We need to collaborate with civil society, with NGOs, with human rights activists. We need to look at this as a whole of society approach, if only to protect ourselves while we do our jobs. I think the last part is, please find a good lawyer, because, in many ways, it's not just our security that's under threat. The law has been weaponized because impunity online is impunity offline. Violence online is violence offline. So I wish you all luck, great courage. This is what our times demand.
Shall we send the second one too? Yes, it's coming.
У нас трагедия, у нас ад. От решения одного человека впервые в истории всего человечества зависит жизнь на земле. 13,5 миллионов украинских беженцев – это неслыханная трагедия. Рост числа беженцев больше, чем в первый год Второй мировой войны. 6 миллионов детей. Без своих комнат, игрушек, друзей, бабушек. Без права жить дома и без права жить на своей подушке. Но, может быть, право спать на своей подушке – одно из основных прав человека. Думаю, есть расчет, что беженцы начнут вызывать раздражение, ксенофобию, и Европу поразит кризис правительств. Но солидарность людей оказалась сильнее. Вообще говоря, вы меня извините, вот собравшиеся в зале, но народы оказались лучше своих элит. Вы отлично знаете, как ваши коллеги на публике говорили о правах человека, а потом подмигивали президенту Путину, мол, это про права человека только для общества. А вообще-то у нас тут с вами реалполитик. Так что давайте поговорим о газе и нефти. И тот же Путин знал все это отлично. И с презрением относился к тем, кто начинал с ним ныне разговаривать про ценности и гуманизм. Он слишком хорошо знал цену. И весь мир старался не замечать политические аресты, допустим, Навального, а потом других его оппонентов. Потом мир старался не замечать упразднения выборов с помощью изменений в Конституции. Затем уничтожение независимых от государства медиа. Видимо, настает время заниматься реабилитацией собственных ценностей. Надо всемирно продолжать поддержку медиа и журналистов, оказавшихся в изгнании. Помочь беспримерным, фантастическим усилиям репортеров без границ. Помочь Латвии, в первую очередь, Латвии, которая вместе с репортерами восстанавливает медиа после их настоящего геноцида. Обсудите, пожалуйста, идею создания Мирового фонда поддержки прессы в изгнании. Он может получить имя Анны Политковской. Есть старая фраза: «На войне первой убивают правду». Это очень плохая поговорка. Давайте дадим правде шанс выжить. Спасибо.
Well, these two powerful messages, still to digest, but Kirill, you are the editor-in-chief of the Novaya Gazeta Europe. Kirill Martynov, a close friend and colleague, of course, of Dmitry Muratov, founder of the Free Moscow University, and you are working hard to make Novaya Gazeta alive outside Russia. Can you tell us a bit what is your perception of the evolution of the Putin propaganda machine, and how do you see the situation now? Also following
Thank
up.
you so much. I very appreciate this opportunity to address Parliament and the European community as a Russian journalist. And this moment...
Kirill, sorry, if you want to speak Russian?
Well, I just wanted to...
Okay.
Well, I switched to Russian in a minute, but I wanted to say it's a very special moment for me because it's the first time when we publicly meet each other with Dmitry Muratov after the destroying of Novaya Gazeta in Russia, and we share the common meeting, even if he have to address us in like a video recording, because, well, we spend a lot of time together in Moscow, obviously, and now he take care about our journalists who are still staying in Russia, and we try to recreate Novaya Gazeta abroad, like Novaya Gazeta Europe, in a kind of exile. So I switched to Russian. Я думаю, что из нашей перспективы, из перспективы российских независимых журналистов, очень хорошо ясно и видно, что то, с чем мы сейчас сталкиваемся, это крупнейший, как минимум, за десятилетие кризис независимых медиа в Европе. Мы знаем, что свобода слова – это редкая возможность, что существует множество регионов мира, где ее нет и не существовало исторически, где ее только предстоит построить. Но мы видели Россию, в которой после перестройки, после правления Михаила Горбачева, одного из сооснователей «Новой газеты», свобода слова, настоящее слово была. Мы выросли как подростки, как дети, как студенты в России, которая была достаточно свободна. Вы прекрасно знаете, что в марте российские власти ввели, очевидно испугавшись нас, очевидно испугавшись того, что общество не поддержит эту войну, российские власти ввели беспрецедентную военную цензуру, которая запрещает называть войну войной и которая заставляет профессиональных журналистов отворачиваться от реальности и молчать, когда власти открыто совершают военные преступления. Мы на это никогда не пойдем, и мы не пошли на это полгода назад, и, собственно говоря, поэтому мы Мы и многие наши коллеги из независимых изданий находятся в ситуации изгнания и работают из-за рубежа. Мы оставили после себя разрушающуюся страну, гибнущее общество. И вещь, о которой я призываю помнить, несмотря на то, что наши мысли сейчас с украинцами и Украиной, и самые важные события для нашего будущего, для будущего Европы и для будущего России происходят сейчас на фронте этой преступной войны. Я призываю также помнить, что по ту сторону границы и по ту сторону этой новой стены, которую Владимир Путин построил в Европе, находятся миллионы людей с очень разными взглядами, с конкретными человеческими жизнями, про которых мы сейчас знаем все меньше и меньше. В России по-прежнему есть пытки в полиции, в России по-прежнему есть все возможные виды насилия, включая очень высокий уровень домашнего насилия. В России есть экологические катастрофы, экологические проблемы. И мы знаем об этом все меньше и меньше. Не только потому, что мы каждый день должны писать и говорить о войне, но и потому, что работа профессиональных журналистов в нашей стране стала невозможной. Каждый день приходят дурные новости из моей родной страны. Сегодняшний день не стал исключением. Как вы, наверное, уже знаете, несколько часов назад Владимир Путин объявил частичное военное положение. Это тоже, наверное, вещь беспрецедентная в мировой истории. Так же, как он не ведет якобы войну и называет это специальной операцией, так же, как он якобы объявил частичную мобилизацию, сейчас у нас частичное военное положение, и все выглядит так, как вот злые языки говорили, что, собственно говоря, это не Россия аннексирует территории так называемых Донецкой и Луганской народных республик, а это Россия присоединяется к тем порядкам, к тем правилам, которые оккупационные власти придумали для этих территорий за последние 8 лет. Полное бесправие, невозможность работать не только журналистов, но и правозащитников, отсутствие любых гражданских институтов. Вот что на самом деле означает частичное военное положение, которое сейчас будет как раковая опухоль расползаться по России в ее более отдаленные от фронта районы. Мы знаем на собственном примере, что те слова, которые часто повторяются в европейских институтах о демократии и свободе слова, они не являются пустыми лозунгами, просто по той причине, что у нас перед глазами негативный пример. Мы знаем, что происходит с диктатурой, когда любые институты умирают, и когда мы теряем возможность как граждане влиять на решения нашего правительства. Мы находимся внутри этой трагедии, и когда я сейчас имею возможность говорить как бывший преподаватель нескольких московских университетов со студентами в Европе, я об этом, я прошу их защищать демократию и помнить про наш негативный пример. И я очень присоединяюсь к тому, о чем уже было здесь сказано, о том, что наша задача – это одна из практических задач, в которой мы должны сейчас инвестировать наши профессиональные усилия, заключается в том, чтобы остановить грязные коррупционные деньги и сделать так, чтобы диктатура, как эрозия, и коррупция, как эрозия, не распространилась на страны за пределами Российской Федерации, не распространилась на Европу. В то же время, помимо всех этих достаточно очевидных вещей, я хочу сказать, что у нас есть определенные достижения. Мы не перешли на сторону пропаганды, мы не поменяли наших редакционных политик. Меня часто спрашивают про судьбу иммигранта, и я отвечаю, что я, в общем, не слишком заметил иммиграции, поскольку я не потерял своей работы. А моя работа – это самое важное, что есть в моей жизни, гораздо важнее, чем родной город, в котором ты имеешь возможность жить. Мы выжили и работаем. Работают десятки и сотни независимых журналистов из России. Сохранились крупнейшие редакции телеканала «Дождь», возобновленного, восстановленного «Эхо Москвы», который теперь называется просто «Эхо», новой газеты в виде новой газеты Европы, появились новые независимые издания, работающие на русском языке по высоким стандартам журналистики. Я думаю, что мы наряду с правозащитниками из России, которые также не были сломлены, мы остались единственным общественным институтом, который связывает современную Российскую Федерацию с Европой, европейскими ценностями и свободным миром. Тот факт, что 2 года подряд Нобелевская премия досталась в том числе выходцам из России, для нас это очень высокое признание и возможность продолжать нашу работу. И вместе с правозащитным центром «Мемориал» и вместе с нашими коллегами в европейских странах, вместе с нашими украинскими и белорусскими коллегами, я очень счастлив, что украинские правозащитники назвали «Мемориал» своими друзьями, несмотря на войну. Мы будем вести и продолжать эту нашу профессиональную задачу, мы будем ее выполнять, и мы будем предлагать публичную дискуссию для страны, которая принуждается российскими властями к молчанию и к покорности. Я не знаю, как долго нам придется быть единственными институтами, оставшимися от нормального общества в России, а именно независимыми медиа и правозащитными организациями. Но я думаю, что ощущение этой трагедии и желание добиться мира и процветания для Украины, для Европы и для России хватит надолго. Столько, сколько нужно, столько эти институты будут работать. Прямо сейчас наша крупнейшая задача, пожалуй, заключается в том, как мы все еще можем работать с журналистами, находящимися на территории Российской Федерации. Очевидно, что эти люди не защищены законом. Очевидно, что мы не можем официально предлагать им профессиональные контракты. Очевидно, что часто у этих людей нет возможности путешествовать по миру, свободно выезжать из России. Мы в содружестве с организациями европейскими будем решать этот вопрос для того, чтобы мир и Европа в целом знали, что именно происходит в России, и знали это не из пропаганды, не из слухов, а из профессиональной журналистики. К сожалению, решение этой задачи с каждым днем становится все более трудной и все более опасной для тех людей, кто сделал этот выбор и продолжает работать репортерами в современной России, часто скрывая, обычно уже теперь скрывая свои имена. И я хочу закончить на том, что я также присоединяюсь к предложению моего друга и моего бывшего начальника Дмитрия Муратова о том, что медиа в изгнании, не только российские, те, которые работают с Филиппинами или с другими странами с диктаторскими режимами, нуждаются в Международном фонде независимой журналистики. И мы бы сочли огромной честью, и семья Анны Политковской сочла бы огромной честью, если бы такой фонд назывался ее именем. Спасибо.
Thank you, Kirill. And after your important words, I pass it on to Angelina. Angelina, it's really an honor, and I am a bit moved by your presence that you managed, because you wrote to us this morning that you were in Shield in Kiev. So you are heads of news in the public broadcaster in Ukraine, and you report about political and social affairs. You also worked as a presenter and journalist for major independent media in Ukraine, and you conducted award-winning investigative journalist work. You also founded the Public Interest Journalism Lab, so it is super interesting to have you on board to know what is the situation. First of all, how are you? How are things going in Kiev? And second, what is the situation with the information war that you are living in Ukraine? And thanks again for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and my regards and respect to the work that Matthew is doing in the name of his mother. I really wish justice in this case. We all know, as journalists, what impunity can do, to the work of other journalists and other generations of journalists. So I really wish that justice is done in this case. I'm speaking to you from suburbs. I'm just shortly out of bomb shelter, where my newsroom and myself spend pretty much half of each working day. But still, I have to say I'm happy and lucky to have this opportunity to still work in my native town, in the headquarters of the public broadcaster, and even to sustain broadcasting. Just a few words about the context of how we are working. Of course, journalists are, as you know, the targets in this terrible Russian war against Ukraine, as the rest of Ukrainians and the rest of Ukrainian civil society. Just quickly, some very important numbers. According to the reporters of Without Borders and Ukrainian Institute of Mass Information, starting from February 24th, there were 8 journalists who were killed as they were conducting their duties in Ukraine, and 32 journalists who were killed while doing other things, including being combatant, because they were mobilized. Lots of my friends and colleagues were mobilized as well. Some of them were just staying at home, and a Russian rocket hit the house and they were killed. So it's 32 people. Some of them are also, foreigners, not only Ukrainians, but predominantly Ukrainians. I also have to mention that more than dozen of TV towers were attacked in Ukraine. So for us, a question of broadcasting and keeping our job, and the question of security is something that we cannot ignore. It's something that we need to consider each day. This is why all of the Ukrainian media that are broadcasting, that are having any TV live activities, they need to have a bomb shelter. They need to have a studio in a shelter. If you don't have one, it's impossible for you to broadcast while the air alarms are going off in the whole country, in any region, be it the western part, central Ukraine, the capital Kiev, or any other part of the country. And the Ukrainian public broadcaster has offices and bureaus across the whole country. You need to secure that. So it's also a question of resources, a question of finances for many, many media. This is why, apart from the fact that many journalists, many newsrooms were forced to relocate from their hometowns, from their home regions, they also had to reconsider the way their offices look like, the way their studios look like. And it's a huge challenge for many, many, especially smaller independent outlets, which need now to think how are they going to survive, this period. This is why it is very important to, first of all, to thank those who are supporting Ukrainian journalists and Ukraine, but also to raise awareness about this problem. It's not about, only life vests and helmets that we need right now. For example, when you're covering Donbass and your crew is traveling there, you need to take care of a generator, you need to take care of several gallons of gas, because there are no gas stations there, no shops, basically no operating hotels. So you need to have everything in your van in order to make a story, in order to do your job. This is why it is the double cost now. I'm not even talking about security measures. Of course, it's highly dangerous for any journalist now. Another thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is the temporary occupation. Just a quick remark to what Kirill was saying about this thought that Russia is, becoming a part of this temporary occupied territory, the so-called DPR, LPR, and taking in its practices, so to say. I really have to say that I disagree. I really believe it is what Russia is doing. It is the Russian orders that are brought to these temporary occupied territories. It is the persecution of the freedom of speech. It is the persecution of religion. It is the persecution of any human freedoms, and it's something that Russia is bringing to each place that it enters during Ukraine, during this invasion in Ukraine, and what we were able to see after they were leaving these territories, after they were retrieving, including the Kiev suburbs where I am right now. I mean, this place was occupied for almost a month. This house was looted, and the things that were taking place around this place are really, really terrible. This brings me to another thought that I wanted to share with you. It is importance of the work that we're doing, and it is importance of the field work that we're doing. I think it is very important to understand what this war is about, and that it is not, the two sides that are fighting, and we need to have, voices from both sides because it's one side and second side, and there should be balance according to the professional standards. I think it is important to understand that it is about disinformation and propaganda, which I will talk about briefly just shortly. And it is about the fight against imperialistic oppression in the region. And this fight is not just 7 months old, it is centuries old. This is why it is important to understand the context. It is important to be here. For many, many decades, Ukraine, as pretty much every country in the region, has been covered by the foreign media from the Moscow bureaus. Just many global media believed that when you have a correspondent in Moscow, that's enough for this media to cover, Ukraine, Belarus, maybe Kazakhstan, sometimes even Poland. I think what we're facing right now, and the level of how deep the world understands what is happening in Ukraine and what is happening in Russia as well, partially comes from that perspective, that I think it is right to say imperialistic perspective. I think it is important that the journalists have their boots on the ground where they work. And even with all the tragic circumstances that brought so many journalists and so many foreign media in Ukraine now, because, many foreign outlets were banned or faced even some violence in Russia. They needed to leave Russia for many, many reasons. They cannot work there, unfortunately. Many of them came to Ukraine, and I think many of them were able to see why it is important to do the field journalism from the place, to report the place where they are, to look into the eyes of the people about whom, they're doing stories, to travel across the country, to understand the phenomenon, actually, of Ukrainian resistance, which is really, really centuries long. So 2 things, field reporting and context. Many newsrooms and many European newsrooms, global newsrooms, are quite young, and many journalists who are working in these newsrooms, they don't even remember what happened in Turkey during the first wave of Russian aggression and the revolution of dignity in Ukraine. That is also about context. That is also working with the agenda that is a little bit deeper than the regular breaking news stories. And of course, our audience is quickly tired of the breaking news stories. This is why it is important to go behind the story and to explain what is happening about Ukraine. Another point of mine is that Ukraine is not only about the war, and the war is not only about tragedy and violence. It's also about solidarity, it's also about humanity, it's also about help, it's also about courage and resistance. And apart from the fact that Kiev and the rest of the country has been just 2 hours or 1 hour ago under a rocket attack, thanks God, no objects were hit in Kiev, but in other cities they were hit. All of the rockets were shot down from the sky. It is important to understand that Ukraine is a functioning country. I mean, we still go to work, our factories work, our business work, our people are, functioning, doing their jobs. It's a vibrant, young, democratic country, and this story should be told as well. So when I am asked this question, how do we cover Ukraine? Our audience is getting tired of death, and the stories of tragedies. It is not only about tragedy, and it is not only about loss. And of course, we're not here to entertain you, but there is also so much about Ukraine that the world needs to understand. It is a big country, decentralized, with very vibrant regions and with very different, relations between the regional authorities and the central authorities. That is something, by the way, that the Russian soldiers didn't understand when they were entering Ukraine, when they were invading Ukraine. For example, asking people in the village, who is the main guy in the village, who is like the Tsar of the village, while the main guy in the village would be someone who was democratically elected. And sometimes this guy or this woman wouldn't have the best relations with the central authorities. That is also a very interesting thing for the media to look into. But let me quickly get to the point, and I'll finish to the point of propaganda, Russian propaganda and disinformation. Of course, I am speaking from a little bit different context than my Russian colleagues, and we have completely different tasks in this context, not professionally, rather ethically. But I think I can share something that we all learned here during probably the past 8 years, but most certainly during the past 8 months. About the Russian propaganda. Of course, it is not working as bluntly as it used to be. It's not the narrative that Russia is good and the rest of the world bad. It is rather looking into the loopholes of the skin of society to see where doubt and distrust could be. And it could be any topic. It could be European democracy, it could be energy crisis, it could be healthcare and COVID, anything. But what makes strong resistance to that is a strong community. When a community knows itself very good, when there are strong ties between people who have common activities, even in a small village, there is resistance to that. I mean, you cannot tell lies about the head of the village when you know who is the head of the village, right? When you have gone through a number of common activities, collective activities in your community. It is really hard to disrupt a community like that. This is why my message would be that it is important for us media to know our communities, to work for them, to make sure that we, voice their real concerns and their real issues, that we, work with them, that they feel connection between media and their real, real life struggles, their real problems, is that we stop, office journalism, that we go out there. I think it's important for any country and any European country, because what we see now is that the Russian propaganda works everywhere where it is not stopped, where when you work. And not only Russian propaganda, just generally political propaganda and misinformation as well. So the lesson that I could share is that a strong community, is a strong resistance to any challenge, be it an on-the-ground war or propaganda, which in our case is both. And the last, probably, that I would like to say is about support for Ukraine. I think, my role is not to ask you for the weapons. It's something that our government is doing, but my job is to make sure that I spread the word about what Ukrainian world looks like, what Ukrainian work and media space looks like. It is important that the world supports Ukraine. It is important that the world is here, because now with the number of temporary occupied territories, there is no access to these places, and terrible things are happening there. Not only journalists and civil rights activists, and local authorities are being kidnapped, tortured, killed. They go missing in these territories. Just any person, any civilian could be persecuted or killed or tortured just for nothing, just for being Ukrainian. And there is no oversight, over this. There is a terrible word that came in our vocabulary. It is called filtration. That is something that the Russians are doing in the south and in the part of Donbass, in Mariupol. They basically filtrate Ukrainians. They ask them and they check if they have anything to do with, basically with Ukraine. And they could be killed for that. So there is no access of the Red Cross, of the UN missions or OSCE mission. The monitoring mission stopped working in Ukraine to any of those places. So it's like a bloodland with no control, no monitoring, nothing. And I think it's not only a Ukrainian challenge. This can't be happening and taking place in Europe in 2022. And of course, something should be done about that. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Angelina. Thank you. And before giving the floor to our next speaker, I would like that our Vice President shares with us some important news.
Thanks. Just a minute for inform you, parlo in italiano, scusate perché poi mi dimentico che c'è la traduzione simultanea, che la Presidente Metsola, che ci sta peraltro raggiungendo, ha appena annunciato in plenaria che è stato conferito il premio Sakharov, che come sapete è il premio più prestigioso che conferisce il Parlamento Europeo al coraggioso popolo ucraino, rappresentato dal suo presidente eletto, dai suoi leader e dalla società civile. Naturalmente non poteva che essere altrimenti. Sapete che questo Parlamento è da sempre schierato per la difesa dei diritti umani, è stato in questi anni un faro rispetto alla difesa dei diritti umani, delle libertà individuali, e dal primo momento di questa aggressione brutale si è schierato senza ambiguità e con grande forza rispetto alla necessaria difesa del popolo ucraino che coraggiosamente sta combattendo anche per la nostra libertà e per i valori europei. Quindi grazie, mi faceva piacere condividere con voi questa notizia importante.
Grazie a lei. Grazie Angelina. And I would like to now, as we said before, unfortunately, media freedom and freedom of expression is not only a problem outside the European Union, and the case of Daphne reminds us that. So we thought it was important to invite a journalist, a courageous journalist from Hungary. I will try to get your name right. Szabolcsy Gyula, who is you are editor-in-chief of Telex, which is one of the most important independent news sites in Hungary. You were a journalist at origo.eu and then index.hu, Hungary. And then you were the editor-in-chief, and if I'm not wrong, you were the one who started this resignation of all the staff of the newsroom in sign of protest for the changes that were imposed on you. And then you founded the Telex. So can you please tell us a bit the story of your media and also the situation with media in Hungary? Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for the pronunciation of my name. It was perfect. Yes, and thank you for the introduction. I was the editor-in-chief of the most viewed online news site of Hungary, and 2 years ago I was fired after protesting the external political pressure, and the whole editorial staff resigned after my firing, and we founded Telex, which during 2 years became one of the most viewed online news sites in Hungary. So when somebody asks me whether the press freedom exists in Hungary, and for example, Dunja Mijatovic or Vera Jourova often asks me that it exists. So my answer, and I answer always that it is not black or white. It's not a simple question, because my story, my example proves that the press freedom in Hungary is violated, and my story at the same time proves the opposite, that a whole editorial staff can found and possess a new newspaper. So, press freedom in Hungary. The situation is not the same as in Russia, because in Hungary the work is hard, but the journalists are not threatened, persecuted, or killed sometimes. But we have many problems, and I collected these problems which can appear through Europe. For example, the journalists of the free media in Hungary are always considered as the enemies of the government. The government, the ministries, the state-owned companies consider us practically enemies, and our problem that the ministers, the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán never gave an interview. We are not invited to the press conference, and we and the audience and the readers are not informed about the things. For example, Prime Minister Orbán Viktor considers us as a fake news factory. It's another problem that the independent newspapers and journalists who don't repeat the government propaganda are often attacked by the government and the government media. For example, in the relation of the war nowadays, the Russian propaganda, the Russian narrative is very common in our government media. For example, an editor-in-chief of the pro-government media has told about the attacking of the United States, for example. So the independent media, for example, the telex, who want to present the situation in Ukraine, the horrors of the war, these media and these journalists are often discredited, denigrated. And the independent journalists are often seen as American agents or the agents of Brussels, for example. And it's also an attack of the free media that denigration campaigns against the journalists are often launched in the media linked to the Hungarian government. And for example, a denigration campaign was launched against me, and my phone call was obtained illegally, and in the government propaganda they wrote several fake news about my call list, about my phone call list. And the government media also came to my apartment and rang me with a working camera, so it's very threatened. And in the past 12 years, more and more newspapers, radios and televisions have owners who are well connected to the government parties or the oligarchs of the government, and the background of the media is often not transparent. So the readers of Hungary have fewer and fewer independent sources to get their news from. And this media landscape weakens democracy, naturally. And under the government of the Fidesz, the public television and the public radio, so the public media has become, I can say, state media of the government. They uncritically echo the messages of the government about Russia, about the war, and the editorial independence is non-existent for the news programming at the public radio. And the political control over the state news agency is extremely high, and for example, the Prime Minister's press office dictate the coverage here. It's very, very hard. So I can answer for the question that a kind of press freedom exists in Hungary, but real public media doesn't exist, and it's a new question what to do in this situation. And we founded Telex, this new newspaper, in order to reach as large an audience as possible and provide public service content. For example, we want to present what's happening in Ukraine and present the war, and present what's happening in the hospital during the COVID, to show what happens on the street of Hungary when teachers protest. Because this information are kept in silence, or totally false information are published in the government media. So we don't give it up, we won't be silent, and I am optimist, totally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Szabolcs. And I would like to welcome the Commissioner, Vice President of the Commission, Mrs. Jourova, who made us the honor to accept Mrs. Picierno's invitation. And to close this panel, I would like to give the floor to the Director of La Repubblica, Maurizio Molinari, who is connected online. You have a very large experience as a correspondent across the world, and you also have been yourself victim of Russian threats and injury in the last months, just for anticipating and explaining on Repubblica what was going to happen in Ukraine. So can you comment on what you heard until now, Mr. Molinari, please, and give us your take on this situation?
Grazie, buon pomeriggio a tutti da Roma, grazie per questa opportunità, grazie alla Vicepresidente del Parlamento Europeo Pina Picierno per aver reso possibile questo evento, grazie a Matthew Caruana Galizia per quello che lui sta facendo per onorare e preservare l'eredità che ci ha lasciato la sua madre straordinaria, grazie al Parlamento Europeo per ospitarci e al Direttorato Generale per le Comunicazioni di aver preso questa iniziativa, ma soprattutto, adesso vi spiegherò perché, grazie alle testimonianze straordinarie, uniche e a tratti emozionanti che noi abbiamo ascoltato. Non c'è dubbio che noi viviamo in una stagione di conflitti senza precedenti per la nostra generazione, ed è una stagione di conflitti che sono di tipologie molto diverse, ma che hanno in comune l'aggressione alle libertà fondamentali degli individui. fra queste libertà aggredite in queste zone di conflitto, e adesso vedremo quali sono, una delle libertà più aggredite è la libertà di informazione. Io credo quindi che dobbiamo un attimo esaminare quali sono queste tre zone di aggressione alla libertà di informazione e quindi chiederci e aprire una discussione fra noi su quali possono essere le responsabilità, le sfide, le occasioni che il Parlamento europeo può avere per dare le opportune risposte sulla base dei valori dello Stato di diritto che a tutti ci accomunano. Non c'è dubbio che la prima e più grave e più incombente di queste zone di conflitto dove la libertà di espressione è aggredita è l'Ucraina e come Karianina Angelina ci ha raccontato e soprattutto, sottolineo soprattutto, le zone dove il governo russo sta imponendo un'amministrazione militare, i territori occupati dove la limitazione delle libertà degli individui sta aumentando di giorno in maniera brutale. Ora, il punto è come aiutare i giornalisti, anzitutto ucraini, ma anche di altre nazionalità, che tentano di sfidare l'aggressione militare in aree di combattimento per informare e far conoscere a noi quello che sta avvenendo. Io credo che oggi noi, grazie alle nuove tecnologie, al giornalismo digitale che impiega gran parte delle nostre attività, ma soprattutto grazie al coraggio, ripeto, al coraggio straordinario di un numero significativo, importante di giornalisti europei e non ucraini e non sul territorio di guerra, abbiamo a disposizione molte opportunità. E potrebbe essere importante, potrebbe essere decisivo tentare di mettere in connessione questi giornalisti che sono sul luogo e che al prezzo della loro vita raccolgono le informazioni con le nuove tecnologie che noi tutti disponiamo, al fine di aumentare la quantità di notizie, ma soprattutto direi la quantità di immagini e di suoni che noi possiamo disporre sulle aree dell'Ucraina occupata. Questo io credo che sia il primo degli imperativi. È qualcosa che da un punto di vista tecnico non è molto complicato da fare. Chi fa il mio lavoro, il nostro lavoro, sa che oggi ci sono delle agenzie di fotogiornalismo, di fotoreportage dall'aria che possono dare dei contributi straordinari. Bisogna solamente metterle a sistema, dargli un assetto compiuto, trovare dei giornali, e credo ce ne siano una moltitudine nei nostri paesi, pronti a diffondere e a pubblicare e a, attenzione, finanziare queste operazioni, e improvvisamente potremmo noi aprire dal cielo delle finestre straordinarie per raccontare quello di quanto più brutale gli occupanti russi stanno facendo in queste zone dell'Ucraina martoriata. Questo è il primo elemento, la prima necessità, forse la prima urgenza. Ma poi c'è il fronte di quanto sta avvenendo all'interno delle autocrazie. E qui che abbiamo appena ascoltato dal coraggioso collega ungherese, e prima che ci ha consegnato Kirill Martinov, e prima ancora il premio Nobel Dmitry Muratov, ci dicono quanto sia importante creare gli strumenti per consentire a chi vive all'interno delle autocrazie di raccontare ciò che vede e ciò che vive. E guardate, non sto pensando solamente alla Russia o all'Ungheria o a altri paesi dove ci possono essere europei dove ci possono essere delle limitazioni della libertà di espressione, ma ad esempio sto pensando all'Iran, dove ci sono una moltitudine di giovani, di donne, che ogni giorno rischiano la loro vita per mettere delle immagini sui social network, tagliandosi i capelli, battendosi per la libertà solamente perché si levano l'hijab. Noi stiamo assistendo di fronte ai nostri occhi a un grido di dolore di una delle nazioni più antiche e orgogliose del nostro pianeta. Noi dobbiamo ascoltare il grido di dolore delle giovani iraniane. È un imperativo morale per ognuno di noi, esattamente come lo è ascoltare l'imperativo dei giovani di Hong Kong, che rischiano anche loro mettendo sui social network racconti di rivolte personali singole, non violente, contro l'autocrazia cinese. Ora, il punto è come farlo. E su questo secondo me si può aprire una discussione, perché, tanto per fare un'ipotesi, no? Ma se ci fossero delle piattaforme elettroniche, perché il vero problema di chi vive all'interno di queste autocrazie, vuole raccontare, ha il coraggio, raccoglie le informazioni, il suo vero problema è quello di trasmetterle, di farle conoscere fuori. Perché? Perché queste autocrazie hanno un controllo molto ferreo, molto feroce, molto stretto di tutte le comunicazioni elettroniche. Ebbene, se noi riuscissimo, anche qui grazie alle nuove tecnologie, a creare delle piattaforme elettroniche sulle quali questi giovani, o giovani o meno giovani, questi abitanti di queste autocrazie possono comunicare e dove possono mandare queste informazioni e in qualche maniera queste piattaforme le possono moltiplicare in direzione delle popolazioni di questi stati martoriati, io credo che sarebbe qualcosa assolutamente di formidabile. Immaginate che cosa potrebbe significare per chi abita nella Yakuzia, in Siberia, a Mashhad, a Tabriz, nel cuore della Cina, se ci fosse una piattaforma di informazione libera e indipendente su chi soffre delle violazioni dei diritti umani nei paesi autocrazie e dispotici, e il Parlamento europeo consente al mondo di sapere che cosa sta avvenendo. E poi infine l'ultimo terreno, ed è quello sul quale rispondo perché più mi riguarda, attenzione, è il terreno dei nostri paesi. Queste autocrazie sono delle autocrazie che molto spesso si rendono protagoniste di interferenze maligne nei nostri paesi. Tentano di penetrare nelle nostre opinioni pubbliche, nei nostri account, nei nostri siti internet, nelle nostre conversazioni, nelle nostre menti, usando alcune delle metodologie più sofisticate e avanzate che ci sono sul mercato, diffondendo bugie, diffondendo falsità, diffondendo delle fake news talmente sofisticate, talmente articolate, da poter condizionare l'orientamento dell'opinione pubblica, da condizionare l'orientamento di alcuni organi di informazione. L'offensiva contro le nostre opinioni pubbliche nei nostri paesi è qualcosa da far tremare i polsi. Occupa gran parte, buona parte del mio tempo controllare la necessità di difendersi da queste infiltrazioni. Ciò che ogni direttore di giornale si trova ad affrontare è qualcosa che per tutti noi sarebbe stato inimmaginabile 3 anni o 5 anni fa. E qui però c'è una questione molto seria che riguarda la proprietà intellettuale, la necessità di difendere il nostro spazio umano all'interno dell'Unione Europea, la nostra proprietà intellettuale, i nostri diritti digitali, e di difendere in ultima istanza le nostre libertà dalle aggressioni che provengono da fuori e che puntano sulle bugie, sulla strategia più sofisticata delle bugie per aggredire le nostre libertà e distruggerle dal di dentro. I giornalisti che vengono aggrediti dagli account riconducibili apertamente, perché queste autocrazie non si nascondono. Questo è l'altro elemento incredibile. Nei nostri paesi dell'Unione Europea ci sono giornalisti che vengono aggrediti da account riconducibili direttamente a queste autocrazie, che diffondono delle falsità, ma in quantità industriali, al fine di fomentare gli odi più biechi nei confronti di singoli persone che hanno il cui unico delitto è quello di dire la verità sui diritti violati in Russia, in Cina, in Ucraina, in Iran. Ora, questa è una questione urgente, è una questione che ha a che vedere con la difesa delle nostre libertà ed è una questione dove il Parlamento europeo, secondo me, può essere di una utilità straordinaria per tutti noi operatori dei media, ma soprattutto per tutti noi cittadini dell'Unione Europea. Quindi ecco, insomma, riassumendo, tanto per soccorrere e aiutare la diffusione delle notizie nella zona di guerra, quanto per aiutare chi nelle autocrazie sta tentando di raccontarci quanto le libertà vengono violate e per difendere i nostri cittadini dalle aggressioni maligne che arrivano da fuori, Io credo che noi tutti ci dobbiamo interrogare come il Parlamento europeo può aiutare a una riflessione collettiva, a una riflessione urgente per far sì che le nostre libertà siano protette, ma che soprattutto noi possiamo fare l'impossibile per proteggere anche le libertà degli altri, anche le libertà di chi è fuori dall'Unione Europea, perché ciò che noi difendiamo in ultima istanza sono i valori fondamentali degli individui. Grazie.
Grazie Direttore, thank you very much. And I think on these points, Mrs. Jourova will have a lot to say because you are working hard on all the topics touched upon Mr. Molinari. But with your permission, I would like to ask the participants if they have any questions for this panel before going to the next one. We are running late, so just a couple of questions. Yes, please, go ahead, introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Maja Sever. I'm a journalist from Croatia. I'm also president of Trade Union of Croatian Journalists and also president of European Federation of Journalists. We heard the message of colleague Muratov and Martinov and the idea of formation of a fund for journalists in exile. So what do you think about it? Have you heard, what do you talk about this proposal? A lot of unions and journalist organizations and associations try to help as much as they can, but there are more and more colleagues who need help and they will need in a long time. If we want to protect journalism and freedom of expression in countries that are under dictatorship and censorship, the aid mechanism should be stronger and the support for these journalists should be stable.
I guess your question is addressed to the representative of the institutions, so I don't know, Mrs. Picierno, would you like to...
Sì, grazie ovviamente per le suggestioni. Approfitto anch'io per ringraziare ovviamente tutti gli intervenuti, è stato davvero un panel ricco di suggestioni. Lei fa una domanda interessante, chiede ovviamente se se ho capito bene, perché chiedo scusa, stavo rispondendo ad un messaggio, quindi se cortesemente...
Questa cosa di un fondo per i giornalisti in esilio, quello che diceva anche Muratov, se si può avanzare su questo alle istituzioni europee, forse anche... Possiamo anche chiedere alla Commissione.
No, la proposta che è stata avanzata nel corso del panel, che naturalmente ho seguito, mi sembra una proposta davvero molto interessante, ne discutevamo anche prima, commentavamo mentre ascoltavamo gli interventi, mi sembra una proposta che dobbiamo supportare e che sicuramente c'è l'interesse di supportare. Per quanto riguarda il Parlamento europeo sicuramente lo faremo, capiremo anche insieme alle altre istituzioni europee qual è la strada per farlo al meglio, perché è evidente, lo abbiamo ribadito più volte qui oggi, il lavoro che voi fate è prezioso rispetto alla difesa dei valori che le istituzioni europee sono impegnate appunto a difendere da sempre, quindi è chiaro che l'idea di istituire questo fondo può rispondere bene ai nostri interessi comuni. Da parte del Parlamento c'è l'interesse chiaramente ad occuparcene, capiremo insieme come proseguire su questa strada. Attualmente ovviamente non le so dire come, perché dovremo approfondire e capire anche come stanziare questo fondo, come articolarlo, in che modo poi anche riconoscere questi fondi, però insomma le ribadisco che c'è l'interesse da parte del Parlamento certamente ad approfondire la questione. Mi sembra una proposta interessante.
Maybe we can sell at least one of the Russian super yachts that has been seized and use it to fund this fund to support Russian journalists in exile. In that way, there will be a kind of justice, I think.
One would be enough.
One was seized in Malta that's worth 150 million euros, so...
I look at the room for Yes, please.
Hi, and thank you very much to the panel. My name is Tom Fell. I'm an Irish journalist and an associate professor of journalism at the University of Galway. I'm just wondering if the panel had any thoughts on how European citizens can be protected better from so-called fake news, disinformation and misinformation, and if there's any role there for the Parliament or for the Commission in enforcing stronger legislation against tech companies like the Facebooks and the Googles.
Look, as Mrs. Jourova will speak about this, I would suggest if you have some questions for the journalists who took part in the panel, otherwise we pass it to Mrs. Jourova, because I think we are all interested in hearing about the Media Freedom Act. So, yes, please.
I'm Helle Digma from Estonia. I'm the president of Estonian Association of Journalists and also a freelance journalist of 30 years. Maybe I understood wrong, but I had this feeling that our colleague from Ukraine said that the ethics of journalists working in Russia and Ukraine are different. I can see that the situation is different, the context is different, but the ethics and the rules of journalists should be the same all over. The question is now directed to Russian and Ukrainian colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. So I pass it on to Angelina, and I don't know if Kirill wants to add something as well.
Could you please repeat what is exactly the question? Because I heard the thought that we're in different contexts and positions, of course, but what is really the question?
Maybe if you can explain better your statement regarding the fact that the ethics you think should be or are different between Russia and Ukraine, being a journalist in the professional standards.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yes, it was my statement. Thank you so much for this question. Well, I believe we work and we are responsible, first of all, for our audience, and we need to understand what is happening in our country. And of course, I mean, what we're doing here in Ukraine is completely different from what the Russian society is doing. You know, I frankly, I don't think it is my job to criticize what the Russian colleagues are doing. I have a huge respect to what Novaya Gazeta has been doing over all these years and now as well. But frankly speaking, I don't know what the Russian independent media should be doing in the situation of mobilization, when, you know, their citizens, their compatriots, their sometimes people whom they loved are mobilized to go and kill us Ukrainians. I don't know. I mean, some of the Russian colleagues chose a path of explaining how do you get away from mobilization. I mean, it's their choice. It's what they're doing. I know that Ukrainians are doing different things, and I don't want to even imagine what Ukrainians would be doing, but probably giving recipes for mass protests, really. But we are coming from different contexts and different countries, and of course, I can understand an ethical challenge as well for the Russian independent media to work in a situation where part of the country, part of their own country, supports this terrible war. I mean, how do you talk to these people? How do you do what you have to do? I mean, what do you do when all of your work for decades now looks like this? I mean, it's a question to my Russian colleagues. It's a question to Kirill as well. But in case of Ukraine, I mean, we don't have to explain to Ukrainians why they need to go and defend their land. It's not something that we're doing. Our job looks completely different because this is what Ukrainians are doing in small villages and big cities. Our job is, frankly speaking, to work and cover the situation under the martial law, and it's also quite strict, and there are certain limitations. But I have to say also, it's very important to stress that it's the martial law and the limitations for the journalists that we're facing, it's rather a wide consensus between media, Ukrainian media, and, well, generally the government and the armed forces. It has been developed in a dialogue between us. It's nothing, that for example, the armed forces brought and told us, this is how you work now, guys. We are still a democratic country. We have a dialogue, and it's a consensual limitation that we have, but it's a different topic. Thank you for this question.
Thank you, Angelina. We see that it's dark in Kiev, so okay, Kirill, do you want to react quickly, please?
Yeah, for us it's probably the worst question, how we can be still journalists if your government and at least partly your country is in aggressive war, which they started, or probably we started, if you want to call it so. And I don't have any good answer on this situation. I think that it's very precious to have contacts with Ukrainian colleagues these days, and I'm very thankful for this attitude from them. I have friends in Kyiv, in our journalist profession, and so on, to the whole of Ukraine, and we see how Angelina is sitting there now, and we understand that a lot of male journalists in Ukraine just on the front line right now. So we have to remember this wherever we talk about these ethical questions. And I understand what will be next. We need to very carefully investigate any single case of war crimes during this war. And I think that this work could be only possible if we can cooperate. And I think that Russian journalists, real journalists, will do everything to provide full information from from Russian side about how these war crimes were created. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to go on with this because it's a very interesting topic and very touching panel, but time runs against us. So I would like to thank again the participants to this panel and give the floor to the Vice President of the Commission, who is here for values and transparency, who is here with us only 15-20 minutes. So, but you have just published a very important piece of legislation for the media, and if you can give us the big lines of this. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, dear Madam Picierno, dear Matthew, dear Mr. Dool, dear friends. Yes, I will, of course, I will kill all 20 minutes by what I want to say. Maybe there will be some space for questions, but I will not kill the whole time just by a dry explanation what's Intermedia Freedom Act, because you can read it yourself. I will touch upon this shortly. First of all, I came here to pay tribute to Daphne Caruana Galizia. We have been 5 years since she would, and Matthew, you are waiting for justice all those years. You would not believe me how many things I promised to Matthew what we will do in Europe to protect journalists better. And we try to work on it. We introduced several pieces of legislation and anti-SLAPP and recommendation to the member states to protect journalists better, very practical set of rules and so on. This job gives me a unique opportunity to get deeper into the world of media and journalists without having own experience being ever a journalist. I was in front of Charlie Hebdo. I was at the cemetery where your mother lies, and I was in front of Jan Kuciak's house. I spoke to Italian journalists who have from the south, who have several years police protection against mafia. I didn't speak to all injured journalists every year in Europe. In 2020, we had 900 heavily injured journalists, especially during the protests, some injured by police corps. And I didn't speak to tens of thousands of journalists who are every day under the digital threats. This is the reality. When you combine it with the data which show that the politicization and economic pressure on media is increasing almost everywhere in Europe, we have a very dark picture and a call for action. I also spoke to some living legends, especially Maria Reza. I have never had an opportunity to speak to Dmitry Muratov, but I spoke to the journalist in Lviv when I was 2 weeks ago. And only when you stand face to face to the people who are doing the job, being willing to sacrifice their lives, you realize what our obligation is, that we have to protect them by all means. That's why the EU is sending quite reasonable money to Ukraine for protective equipment and equipment of shelters and many things I saw. So the helmets and equipment prepared to be transferred to the battlefield. We already paid almost 15 million euros, and another 15 million is now prepared to be paid. And why we are doing that? We desperately need the journalists to be there and to give us the facts, and to also support the investigation of war crimes, which Kirill mentioned. So they are doing an incredible job, and we have to do everything to protect them and to help them, because the first victim of every war is the truth. And this is exactly what's happening now. This is the first digital war. This is the first modern history war on European territory, and we are confronted with a lot of new phenomena, including the abuse of digital channels for spreading the propaganda and war propaganda. And I would never believe, I will ask the managers of Facebook, Google and others very soon after the invasion, sometimes in February, now you have to choose the site. I would never believe I will say that. But, of course, we don't want them to distribute the fake news and the propaganda, which will fuel further also the divisions in our society, because the war is a horrible stress test for our democracies and our society. Here comes the Media Freedom Act, because which I was asked to comment here, because we see issues in the media sphere in all the almost all the member states. Where are the Scandinavians here? They are doing quite well. Also, for instance, for Finland, we have very low figures showing that Finnish people are the least affected by disinformation. And when you look at the correlation, there is the highest trust for media, the independent media. This correlation seems to be very logical, but at the same time, when you realize it, the lower the trust in media, the higher the disinformation. This is pretty dangerous cocktail we are forced to drink now. That's why we came with the Media Freedom Act, because we believe that the media play absolutely essential role in our democracy, but also for the security. Today, we had a very tense debate in the plenary about the rise of radicalization and extremism. And again, I was saying that we have to do something to keep our independent and professional media alive in the EU. And sorry, Madam from Croatia, I don't have an answer. You asked about the money. I have to admit, you also didn't have the answer. The Media Freedom Act does not solve the key issue of the lack of money for the professional and traditional media. This is still to be resolved. Maybe I will come to it later. Who will stop me, by the way? Madam Metsola, when she enters, I will Stop?
Yes.
She's coming, yeah.
She's coming? All right, so hurry up. What Mr. Daul said, the enemies of the state. When we see the autocratic tendencies in the state, we always see the same pattern. The definition of the enemies of the people, not of the state, of the people. That's a difference. Media, minorities, independent judges, NGOs, active citizens, and professional state bureaucrats who are not willing to cover the corruption, for instance. It's all, you know it, no? So that's why in Media Freedom Act, we are proposing the rules which will decrease the possibilities of the state to influence the editorial content, to hire or to use the spyware against the journalists, to push the journalists to disclose the sources. We are introducing new competition rules for the market because the competition rules we have in Europe now are too weak. And for instance, for KESMA cartel, you cannot use it at all because the European rules are focused on much bigger transactions, and Hungary has switched off the competition rules for media. And then you have the monster which covers several hundreds of outlets, and that's why, which also shows that the media pluralism in Hungary is endangered. Transparency for state advertising and transparency of ownership of media. Might be that in the legislative process we will be stronger on transparency of financing of media. Maybe it will come as a proposal from the co-legislators, and the Commission will, of course, seriously consider that. There must be proper enforcement, and I will, due to the lack of time, will not go into details. The destiny of this law will not be easy. It will be uphill struggle because many say, so you regulate the media, so you start censoring or decreasing the freedom of speech. My answer is we are not regulating the media. We are regulating the space for the media, the environment where they can survive and work freely as a strong actors in democratic system. We are giving the recognized professional media the power to oppose the digital platforms at the moment when the platforms want to moderate the content produced by the media. We believe they should have strong voice and defend their content better. And where am I? I didn't take glasses. Oh, I cannot read that. Yes. Then from some member states I hear, why regulation, why not directive? Well, because we want to be sure that the law will apply in the same way in all the member states. When we adopt directive, then we are giving the member states too much space to deviate from the main purpose. From some states we hear, do not touch media, it's a holy cow. We have the system which works well, we don't need any stronger protection. I think that it won't be easy to promote this law and to get it through the legislative process, but I believe that also the media sector itself will be helping, because when somebody normal reads the text, he must see that this is not something which seeks to regulate the freedom of speech or the independence of media, just the opposite. So I have some nice phrases at the end of my paper. Do you want to hear that, or do you want to give me some questions?
Maybe questions.
Okay.
Because
thank you.
I'm sure that journalists will be willing to ask you about the Media Freedom Act. So anyone I see two. So first.
Good afternoon. My name is Hans-Martin Thielak. I'm a journalist from Germany, also part of the Corey Files project, which is now nominated for the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize. We in this project, like many journalists all over Europe, rarely face the problem of the Commission not respecting the rules on transparency when it comes to access to documents. There's a regulation in place for 20 years now, and Commission officials really just don't respect timelines. It's being argued there's not enough staff to respect laws. So I would like to ask you, as the Commissioner responsible for transparency, what have you done and what do you want to do to make sure that existing laws and regulations in this respect are being respected by the Commission, so that you can also set an example to member states which might also have problems with giving access to documents? Thank you.
Yes, I tried more than 1 year, maybe 2 years, to withdraw the old legislation which is pending in the Parliament and replace it by modern legislation for the access of documents, which will reflect on the new technologies which are now used in communication. Unfortunately, this was not successful, so now I plan to come with internal rules for the Commission which will reflect on the new technologies and also introduce the rules which will enable us to speed up the processes and maybe to simplify the procedures. It's true that we have a lot of questions, and we are, when I say a lot, thousands a day. And so there is some staff shortage, but I believe that if we simplify the rules, we will manage better. For the next year work program, I plan to do something, either the legislation for all institutions, which is not very probable, but rather it will be about the new rules for the Commission itself.
Okay. Well, I see there are two more questions. The President of the European Parliament has just, so let's welcome her, and then we'll continue afterwards with some questions, if you allow me. Thank you. President Metsola, very much welcome to this seminar on media freedom. Thank you. You have a huge number of journalists who are willing to listen to you, to your words. So now, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm just amazed. I have never been in this room, and I have been in this parliament for almost 10 years. So it's great. So good afternoon to you all. Vice President Picierno, cara Pina, Vice President Jourova, dear friends. In her last recorded interview, Daphne Caruana Galizia talked about the harassment and abuse that she faced on a daily basis. It doesn't affect my work, she said, but it is definitely affecting other people. They see what's happening to me, and they might not want to deal with that. She later added that that journalists self-censor, that people are afraid of consequences. It's becoming very, very difficult. She was right, of course, in that the threats faced by journalists are very real, whether that is online intimidation, through frivolous lawsuits or open threats of violence. We only need to look around us to see their effects. On the 16th of October 2017, Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated. She became a target because she was a threat. And that should never have been. We often speak in this House about the right to freedom of speech as if it were something to be taken for granted. But the reality is that this cannot be further away from the truth. Many of us, even in this room, remember a time where dissent was not only punishable by social exclusion, but also by the law. This was wrong by all means, but the fact that it was wrong does not mean that it can never happen again. We must never forget this. And in doing so, we must continue to remind people why freedom of speech is so important, why people fight all over the world for it, why people have died for it. And this is why today we will honour Daphne Caruana Galizia's memory and legacy by awarding a prize that bears her name, by distinguishing outstanding journalistic work, guided by the very same values she always stood and fought for. This House is giving the strongest of messages in support of media freedom, because we need to be as clear as ever. Without freedom of media, there can be no real freedom. We also need stronger European systems to prevent this happening ever again. For years, this House has had the protection of media freedom at the top of its agenda, calling for new rules to protect journalists from being silenced. At the time of her assassination, Daphne herself had her bank accounts frozen and over 40 lawsuits filed against her. We have seen similar cases of varying degrees and tactics used against journalists across our union, and this simply cannot be in a democracy. The European Parliament is now working on the new Media Freedom Act that will allow journalists to do their work without having to fear financial or emotional ruin, or even for their lives. This act, the Daphne Law, as we like to call it, has also understood that the new digital environment has exacerbated the problem of the spread of disinformation. And to counter this, we need a common strategy to face foreign interference and disinformation campaigns, while also giving more support to independent media fact-checkers and researchers. We are working together as well as with the Member States to preserve and strengthen independent journalism within our union. It is something that we have been talking about for a very, very long time. So my last sentence is that let me say this in the clearest possible manner. This House stands tall and steadfast together in defence of media and press freedom. And I know that with colleagues, with people across the institutions, with Vice President Jourova, with Vice President Picierno, this is a fight that we can and we will win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Maybe we have time for 1-2 questions before concluding the seminar. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam President, Madam Vice President. I asked a question earlier that wasn't answered. My name is Tom Fell. I'm a journalist from Ireland and a professor. I'm just wondering if the Parliament or the Commission or both of either in the Media Freedom Act are considering fines or punishment against tech companies for propagating disinformation and misinformation, and if you would consider creating a media plurality fund, perhaps by taxing digital advertising on tech companies.
Yes and yes, but not the sanction in the Media Freedom Act, but the sanction is under the Digital Services Act. It should be up to 6% of annual global turnover of the digital company. Of that digital company which does not fulfill the conditions of the Digital Services Act, which obliges them to pay attention to the content, first of all, to the illegal content, They should not amplify illegal content, otherwise one might look at them as the co-perpetrators of the crime. Yeah? So this is about hate speech, extremism, terrorism, child pornography, and the disinformation which can have the potential of causing very serious harm to security, which has some parameters. So in case the enforcers of the Digital Services Act will see that the platforms are not doing enough to put their house in order, then such a sanction be imposed. Of course, that's the maximum sanction of 6%. The second thing on the fund, I would love to see that. I don't know if it will catch me in this mandate, because I was waiting for the digital tax, because I believe that the money which was which traveled from of the money of advertisers, which simply shifted to the platforms and which is now missing for economic survival of the media, this money should be paid back somehow. And so we tried to achieve that through copyright directive, but it is still not enough, and we have not invented the mechanism of correction of the market. And I don't believe that the public money should do that, should pay, because the taxpayers already paid. They paid with their private data, which they share with the digital platforms. So give us still some time to invent the way, because I really believe that the money from the profits of the digital sector should go to two things: back to the media and to media and digital education. It must not go to the cement or asphalt or similar things.
President.
Well, I have nothing much to add to what the Vice President said, except that this really occupied quite a long part of the negotiations of the Digital Services Act, which we signed today into legislation, actually, with the Council earlier, about a couple of hours ago. Perhaps a different aspect, and this I was co-rapporteur for the SLAP initiative on behalf of the Civil Liberties Committee in my previous life. And this occupied a lot also of our debates as to whether and what are the legislative tools that we have in our infrastructure, in our toolbox that we talk about, in order to make sure that journalists that are being faced with lawsuits that they simply cannot pay because they're either independent or their editorial protection is not financially strong enough. In order for there to be something as a model similar to what we have, for example, in the insurance field, in order for journalists to be protected. I can tell you that there is always a little bit of resistance, both from the, and a little bit is an understatement, both from the private sector or the platforms, but also from the member states. First of all, because this would be perhaps argued that it is a realm of national legislation. 2, simply no competence at EU level for this. And 3, why do we need to do that? Why would we need to legislate on that? So I don't see that there is, that it will take us a while in order to find sort of financial mechanisms in order, as the Vice President said, to look for how the money that is misused, and you need a legal determination of that, to be given to the right victims or recipients of where the funds should go.
Okay, well, sorry, but I'm afraid we need to close the seminar. We are running out of time. And I would like to remind you that we have the prize award ceremony of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize in a few moments at the press conference room. So I invited you to attend there, to be there. And, well, I would like to conclude thanking Vice President Picierno for the organization of this excellent seminar, Matthew Caruana for your inspiring words. President, thank you very much, and Vice President Jourova. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you very much.